welcome everyone to the second part of our Ventures course about helping extend our welcome and supporting those with mental illness. And in this second session, we're going to work more at putting some of the nuts and bolts together and actually working with whether the rubber meets the road. So the first session, which you don't want to miss, and if you didn't catch it, you'll want to go back and see that recording that we'll be releasing shortly. Will help you just talk, work through a whole bunch of the things that we can do to support those people. But before we jump into it, I want to reintroduce Dave for those of you that are just coming in and maybe hitting the second recording first. Dave Eckert is the founder and director of Intersect. It's an initiative within Access Services that supports those at the intersection of faith and mental health through consultation, training, and fostering of collaboration between faith communities and mental health providers. So Dave has spent over 20 years working for Access within various roles, including the director of a mobile psychiatric rehabilitation program, as well as agency chaplain. Dave's also an ordained minister, serving as one of the pastors at Grace Community Church in Chalfont, Pennsylvania, and has done that for the last 15 years. Dave's a certified trainer in the areas of suicide intervention and psychiatric rehabilitation. He's also the co-author of the Opioid Response Network's Opioid Use Disorder Toolkit for Faith-Based Community Leaders. Dave holds degrees in social work, biblical studies, and divinity. He lives with his wife and 3 children in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. And so with that, Dave, I'm going to turn it back over to you and let you take it away for our 2-hour session today.
Great. Thank you, Ensign, and thank you for all who are here tonight, both those of you returning from last week and some new faces. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen with the PowerPoint. I think, Ensign, I'm disabled from being, am I able to share the screen?
You are now, Dave.
Okay. Okay. So, as was mentioned by Ensign, we're trying to get into the nuts and bolts today. And in doing so, one way to think about this work is in a way we want to scratch the itch that each of you have when it comes to how to support people with mental illness in your congregations and communities. And this is going to be uber practical. And we've gone through, as Ensign said, some of these characteristics of good help. And we want to say, how do we take those characteristics and enact them in the actual programs, the ministries, the practices of your local faith community or organization? But I don't want to get to the end of this time and any of you to think, I kind of was hoping he was going to talk about this, and he never did. So before we even jump into what I have to say, I just want to open it up to ask any of you, are there certain parts of this work that you're really hoping we'll talk about tonight? Or specific questions that you really hope that I'll address tonight? I just want to invite you to share so that I make sure that laced into the different pieces of tonight's workshop that we really scratch where it itches. Any questions, thoughts?
Initial contact, when we identify someone who is coming to worship with us that has obvious mental illness. He was rambling, talking about money, talking about putting $20 in the offering plate. Maybe he could buy his way into the church, that kind of thing. And we talked with him, and then he presented himself to our secretary. administrative assistant during the week and was threatening. So just wondered what our initial response could have been better, or maybe we did as well as we could have.
Okay. We will make sure we get into that. Thank you, Colleen. Anyone else have something that you hope we will address tonight?
A number of the people that I serve have bad experiences with churches, although there are some churches that are extremely gifted in working with. What are mistakes which congregations make when trying to minister to the mentally ill?
Okay. We will be sure to address that as well. Thank you, Steve. Anyone else?
I guess all of this makes me want to address labeling, because I don't think labeling is the best way to go.
So it would be helpful if we spend some time talking about the language we use, or how we even talk about or think about people that have this experience.
That plus judging others just randomly.
So how do we avoid labeling and judging?
Yes.
Yep. That's helpful. That's important. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, these are great. Well, when we get to the end, if we haven't, I am going to ask this question again. When we get to the end, I'm going to say, where else is it itching? Or have we adequately scratched the itch you have? And so if we aren't able to lace in any of these concepts as we move through this material, then we'll make sure that we address it when we get to the end.
Anything to address too is when you have a crisis in your church with a bipolar person who's gotten to the extreme high, or a paranoid schizophrenic who's doing something, who's being told to do something about it. How do you deal with that in the church setting? When the crisis occurs, how do you deal with it?
That's good. Great question. One that I definitely had conversations with churches about before. So I've added it to the list. Thank you, Bruce. Any others? This is exactly what I was looking for. Some of these really good practical questions. Okay. We'll move on, but if other ones generate, we want to hear from you. Tonight is about creating space for conversation and making sure those questions get asked and we get super practical. One thing I just want to say about Intersect, I shared with you a little bit about the work last week. Enton shared a little bit today. But I just want to emphasize that what we're doing is really being a teaching hospital. Intersect is not a hospital, mind you. But the idea is, in a teaching hospital, you are instructing people based on what you've been learning in your own hospital. And really what we're trying to do tonight is I'm going to be sharing with you, some of it is research based. And I believe a lot of it can be backed up by research. However, much of what's being shared with you is what we've seen on the ground in communities about things churches have done to best support people living with mental illness. So this isn't just abstract thoughts and ideas. These are practical steps churches have taken. So where we're heading, basically tonight is divided up into 3 parts. First, tools for building a culture of care. And then this all basically is one sentence. Second part, doing this in your faith community. And third, doing this through your faith community. So through your faith community, in other words, for the larger community or region within which your faith community resides. So these are the three parts of tonight. At the end of each of these parts, we will have time for discussion. So first, tools for building a culture of care. I get a common question. Many times I've been asked this. How do you build a mental health ministry? How do you do it? You know, people ask me, should I start a support group? Should we have a specific program or ministry that we start up uniquely built and developed for people in our congregation with mental illness? And people are often looking for me to be able to map out the ingredients for a mental health ministry in the same way that a church may have a small group ministry, or some churches may have a discovery class, or adult education, Sunday school ministry, or community outreach ministry. What is the mental health ministry we should have? I get asked this a lot. And I think this thought, a lot of times when I get asked that question by Peter Drucker, the business specialist, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. In other words, having a culture that is able to support people with mental health struggles in your faith community is more important than whatever specific strategy or ministry you put in place. Why do I say that? And what do I think Drucker is getting at with this when we apply it to the issue of ministry to people with mental illness? Well, I think a couple things come to mind. First, culture dictates what programs we create. So if you have a culture that's responsive and concerned about people with mental illness, and if you're thinking about it in ways that we addressed last week, and if you're thinking about it in a way that says this is a priority for us, then the programs are going to flow out of that. But if you don't have a culture, if you have a culture full of stigma, if you have a culture that doesn't think this is a priority, then that's going to mean different types of programs get created. Second, your strategic plan won't succeed if your culture doesn't support it. If you don't have leadership that is bought in, if you don't have people wanting to live this out on the ground throughout the church, then you can have the most beautiful strategic plan and ministry strategy as a church, but it won't go anywhere because you're trying to do it within a church's culture that isn't that interested in this issue. And so there are some dangers. One typical way that a lot of people say, one way I could answer the question that I said was a common one, how do we build a mental health ministry, is just to say, you know what, start a support group. Provide some space in the church where people can talk about this with each other. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, and I've seen it go well. But I want to talk about a few dangers of building programs before crafting the culture of the church. Okay? First, separate support groups can maintain stigma in certain contexts. Separate support groups can maintain stigma in certain contexts. In other words, oh, it's those people over there. They're the problem, the issue, it's over there in that support group. Now that we've got the support group taking care of it, the rest of us don't have to think about it, and the rest of us don't have to be responsive because the culture over there, the program over there, the support group over there is dealing with it. Second, we can unknowingly emphasize what is distinctive about a person with mental illness rather than what we have in common. Renee, you brought up the issue of labels, right? And of the problem with that. And this gets at this a little bit. When we emphasize the labels, there's the mental health ministry. Those over there are the people with mental illness. Even if we have good intentions, it can emphasize how different they are than the rest of us. Whereas when you have a culture that allows for people to share about mental health struggles in the same way they share about a plethora of other human struggles, it doesn't do that same dividing work of us and them. It becomes all of us have things that we're journeying with that are hard, and we're going to bring all of it to every part of the church life. And when you do that, it has less of a chance of people having shame and there being division and stigma within the church, which is another reason to craft culture before building programs. Third, we can start a support group while our small groups remain unsupportive. Can start a support group while our small groups remain unsupportive. What do I mean by that? Well, if we have small groups in our church where a person can't talk about their mental health struggle, they could bring up a physical health struggle, they can bring up a relational struggle, but they can't bring up the mental health struggle because of the culture of the church, then we really need to realize, instead of saying, I need a separate support group in a ministry, we need to start with the culture of our small groups. Why is it that in our small groups, people aren't bringing up this issue? Maybe it's not because anyone has said, don't bring it up. But if you recall, for those of you who were last week, in my own church, when I preached on this topic, people said, I didn't know until now that I could talk about that here. People need to be given permission, and leaders need to build culture by inviting people to share these sorts of struggles in a small group, rather than allowing our small groups to be culturally places that aren't supportive, while putting all our focus into building separate groups that divide out and say, oh, those are the people over there. And you think about it, it's also tough for the people themselves to want to join that. You know, one of the things that many of us can acknowledge in our culture that's a problem is pornography. And some churches are wondering, how do I deal with this? And the challenge is, if you create the pornography group, hey men, on Saturday mornings at 9, we're gathering for breakfast and discussions of our problem with pornography. How many men do you think are going to want to go to that meeting? Not many, because built into that is, I hope no one shows up. I feel shamed. We're the ones who are dealing with this. Everyone else is okay. Versus saying, how do we make sure that in our sermons, how do we make sure that in our small groups, how do we make sure that in our individual conversations, we create places and spaces where people can build trusting relationships and share about their struggles, whether it's pornography or a lack of being able to forgive or a number of other issues that are hard in life. And so for these reasons, it's often the case that we need to, when building a mental health ministry, we start with crafting the culture of our church before we start focusing on building programs. So one way to put it, with Fiscal and Eber there, for those of you who are old enough to remember,
those guys?
Be a cultural critic, not just a ministry contractor. Okay, that's just an image for you. Your job as a leader in your church is not just to try to start new ministries. How do I build this ministry and build that ministry, and thinking if I can just build the program, everything's fine. Instead, we need to be a cultural critic, which is to say, assess the cultures of our church and not judge them. We're a part of them ourselves. But to be taking an honest look and to say, where can all of our ministries emphasize the importance of supporting people with mental health struggles? Where does it show up in all our ministries, not just in one ministry over on the side? So, some tools for culture building that I want to mention to you. One, prayer requests. I have a person in our church who said to me, Dave, so we have a prayer chain at our church. A lot of churches do, you have an email that goes out with prayers. Person in my church has schizophrenia. He said to me, Dave, could you put out on the prayer chain that I could use some help with my voices that I'm hearing? And interestingly, that despite the fact that I do that work, my jaw almost dropped when he said it, because I wasn't expecting him to feel that comfortable to share that with all the church. But we did it, because why shouldn't we be praying for him in that way? In the same way that people say, Dave, I'm going to be having radiation in a couple of weeks. Could you put that out on the prayer chain? And so one of the ways we can build culture is by saying, where are existing places in our church where we can infuse an attentiveness to mental illness? One is the sorts of prayer requests that we put out to the church. Second, meals. You may have heard it said before, this isn't my line, that mental illness is not a casserole disease. It's not a casserole illness. What do they mean by that? There are certain illnesses that when you know someone in your church is going through something, people say, hey, let's bring them meals. Let's bring them a casserole, right? Old school. Let's bring them some sort of food that is helpful to them. We don't often think about that when it comes to mental illness. If someone's having a difficult season or episode around their mental health struggle, and they've shared some of that with us, one of the things we can do is apply the way that we culturally care for people going through other struggles with meals and reaching out to see if they would find that helpful as well. Third, transportation. You may have had situations in your church where people, maybe because of their age or a physical challenge, need transportation to go to an appointment. Well, a few years ago, a man in our church was undergoing psychiatric treatment. And because of it, he was not in a place to be able to drive himself. He actually asked the church, could I have rides to when I go down for treatment? Because this particular treatment did have a physical nature to it, and he really shouldn't be driving, but it was related to his mental illness. And people from the church gave him a ride. They treated what he was going through the way they would treat other people who had to go to a hospital. Visitation. When he was down at the psychiatric facilities, people from the church visited him. They didn't just think, wow, that's too strange. We visit people after a surgery. We don't visit someone who's going through this. Again, you'll notice with each of these tools, these are the existing tools that all of us use already. It's applying it to mental illness in ways that we often don't. Sermon illustrations. Do the leaders of your church, the people who preach, do they ever infuse examples of anxiety or depression or schizophrenia or trauma into their sermons so that the people living with those experiences feel seen and feel like what they're going through is an area to bring their faith into? I mentioned last week, mental health Sundays, having a Sunday that you set aside each year to be able to address mental illness in a very clear, public way. I've seen that when churches do this, it helps to create a culture in their church. It's not necessarily a new program, though it is a structure. And so this is an example of where I'm not against kind of events. I'm not against programs. It's just, how does your event or program shaped to help all of your church, not just one little part of it, to be responsive to the needs of those with mental illness? Communion testimonies. Each month we take communion the first Sunday of the month. and we have people share their stories of how God's working in their lives. And several people have brought up how God is working in their life in the area of mental illness, which, as I said last week, if you remember, was a way of giving the gift of going second. It's a way for people to go, oh, someone else shared, maybe I can share as well. And finally, though there's other tools you can consider using, like tools building a house, there's many more than I can fit into one list here. But being proximate can do more to change hearts than building programs. Being proximate can do more to change hearts than building programs. In other words, allowing people in your church to spend time with people who are struggling with their mental health. I remember a man that got connected from a local social service organization into our church. And the first Sunday there, we were in discovery class, sort of Sunday school sort of space. And he told the whole room about his past with bipolar disorder, the way he used substances to be able to try to manage that and how it didn't go well. I mean, he shared a lot in that first Sunday. And I could see certain people touched by that reality. And other people kind of like, whoa, I don't know about this guy. But because he kept coming back every Sunday and he was proximate, people were proximate to him, they were near him, they did life with him, I could slowly see their perspectives of him changing in a way that I don't think any one mental health program that partitioned him off to the side would have done. What was really beneficial was the ways in which people got to know him, in which people showed hospitality. So all of these are tools for culture building. You may not want to use all these tools. Rarely does anyone use all of them every time they go to work on the house. But some of these might be the tools you'd like to use for building a culture at your own church. And so we're going to have breakout now for 7 minutes. But I'm going to read the questions first that I want you to be discussing for 7 minutes in your breakout. Question 1. When has an issue in your faith community required you to become a cultural critic more than a ministry contractor? I'm trying to get us thinking about how this has already looked in our faith communities. Have you had other times where you said, you know what, this really isn't an issue of us having to start up a new program. This is an issue of our church has a culture that deals with these issues this way. And we need to figure out how to see cultural change in our church more than we do thinking we're going to fix it with a new program. And second, what are examples of ministry programs that have shaped the culture of your faith community? You know, are there certain programs that you have seen that you've said, yeah, by building this program, we've seen it affect more people than are just in the program. It's actually bringing about change in the culture of our church. We are now going to break out. Enton has listed the 2 questions in the chat. You'll have 7 minutes to discuss these. And over the course of our time together, you'll be in the same breakout rooms. So you'll have time to have more conversation with the folks you're in there with. But for now, these are the 2 questions. Does anyone have any questions for me before we go into the breakout? Okay, so how about Enton, anything else on your end before we send people to their discussions?
Nope, it looks great. We'll have the breakouts go until just about 40 minutes after the hour.
Great.
Okay, here we go. Okay, Dave, we're all back, and so I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. So what I want to do is see if we might just have 2, maybe 3 people who wanted to represent their breakout group and share an insight that came from their discussion from one of these two questions. Maybe something practical that you could see one of the people in your group wanting to do to build the culture of your own faith community. Just share with us maybe a theme from your discussion. Anyone would like to go first?
Two ways in which my congregation has built and continues to build trust among all of the members. One way is in our small groups, and those are very intimate. They're private conversations. And as I shared with my group, there's a lady there with whom I share that our mothers experienced trauma with their mothers. In other words, they were involved with murders of both. And so she felt very safe doing that. It was trauma, and we've continued to talk about that and her experiences. The other one is our opportunity every Sunday to share what we call God stories, asking the leadership or the worship leader says, when was God particularly evident to you this week or the last couple of weeks? And some have shared some very personal stories about, I was so depressed that, and this is how God reached out to me. And so it's opened up the conversation that it's okay to not be okay.
Those are two great examples of tools that for the rest of us may be true or not in your particular church, but things for you to consider. How can small groups be an engine for culture change around people talking about this issue of mental illness and getting support and prayer for it? And then are there places where you can tell God stories where people know they have permission to share how God is working in their life amidst their mental health struggles? So, two great tools. Thank you. Someone else like to share from the discussion they were a part of?
Dave, I also see a chat from Carolyn that you might want to share, or I can share it if you'd like.
So from Inclusion to Justice, so it's a resource, From Inclusion to Justice by Aaron Rafferty, the Disability Ministry and Congregational Leadership.
Yeah, our Sunday school class is actually studying this because we have a faith statement that says that we are open to everyone, regardless of many different things. But we feel that we need to go beyond that to what I think you're saying, Dave, about having a culture where everyone just feels like they can be themselves and they can, share what they need to share so that we can help each other. So we're using this as a way of trying to get at that. Walter Brueggemann says of the book, Rafferty urges us to move beyond a paradigm of inclusion to full empowerment, recognition of, and leadership by disabled persons.
That's a great summary statement of the idea that it's not just how do we include those people, but how do we understand those people are us.
Right.
And we're all in this together.
Yeah. Not them versus us, but us working together.
Yes. And I think just the fact of the resource itself says something about another way you can bring about cultural change, which is through those adult education spaces within the life of your church. Right. Where in the same way that you'll teach on the book of Psalms in a class, that can also be a space where you get into some of this material, which for people who aren't naturally going to be interested in this, in all of our churches, there's people who are going to naturally, because of life experience or family or curiosity and gifting, they'll want to read up on these things. They'll want to think about them. There's other people who just go, nah, it's just not my thing. But if you take moment in an adult education space or a period of time to go through a resource like this one, that's a great way of opening up some eyes and creating culture change. Anyone
Here,
else?
this
Go
is
ahead, Lois.
Lois from McPherson. We had a workshop and we brought in a trauma specialist. And we did that because we were having difficulty with some of our children that we weren't sure how to give the best responses to their behavior that wasn't so very pretty. And the leader of the workshop shared her story with her mental health struggles, the trauma that she had gone through, and that opened up a huge space for people to all morning long be sharing their own struggles, things that I have been around these people and never knew that they were working through these struggles. So having someone who's bold enough to set the course and open up, I think is very freeing for others to be able then to come along and share the things that they are experiencing also. And then it's easier for us then to know how to respond to these situations.
And Lois, did I hear you right that the individual was not from within your church, but outside of it?
Yes, outside the church.
And so
it was a professional here in the community.
Yes, and so there's a lot that could be shared from that insight you gave. But one thing I just want to point out is that's another tool in addition to people, the God stories and people sharing from within the church. Sometimes having someone from outside the church to just tell their story also gives a unique space, because that person can be free to say whatever they want to say, and people can, because there's sometimes people, because of potential stigma, don't feel like they can share certain things because they're doing life with you. You could argue that's a reason to share, but to the extent that you want to get sharing, build that culture of sharing, sometimes a person from the outside can be a catalyst for that. And I think that's one thing that stands out to me from that story you told. Thank you. Anyone else before we continue on? Okay, so guys, last week we waited until around 8 o'clock to take a 5-minute break. But because of the nature of the chunks that we're going through today and the points, we're either going to take it now or it's going to be a bit. So I'd rather us take 5 minutes now. If you need to use the restroom, if you need to stand up and stretch, feel free to do that. And anything on your end, Ensign, that would be good for us to consider at this point?
No, that's great. I know it's early, but take a stretch. And so come back at about, 7 minutes before the hour. And we'll continue with the second section.
Thanks, everyone.
Good. Thanks, Dave. I'll keep the meeting open but I encourage you to get up and stretch and chat. Feel free to mute your cameras as you do, because I'm looking forward to the next part of what Dave wants to share with us.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen again. So we've talked so far about creating a community, a culture, that is. And we said we wanted to create a culture of care both in your faith community and through your faith community. So in some ways, we've already given some tools related to culture, and some of those tools have been focused on kind of with how to use them within your faith community. So we've already covered a little bit of this, but I want to really focus in on now the types of tools we use inside and the types of tools we might use outside of our faith community to build a culture of care. And so one way I'm going to do this is by touching on obstacles to doing this and then getting into responses to each of those obstacles. And it's possible that I think, it was asked, what are some mistakes congregations can make in supporting people with mental illness? Some of these obstacles get into those. So one obstacle that can happen is people saying NIMBY. Can anyone tell me what NIMBY means?
Not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard. That's right. Now, few people say not in my backyard, but I have had times where I've reached out to faith communities to try to connect someone we served to their church. And people have told me, yeah, that's just not our area. And they were basically saying, this isn't something I want to really be paying attention to. There was a homeless shelter in our area that had to get relocated. And there was a church near where the new shelter was going to be that publicly said, this leadership said, we don't think they should be here. And so this is something that we have to respond to. And I think one thing we can think about, one thing we can communicate if our church is wrestling with this is this concept. It's already in our house. In other words, we're concerned about not having someone from the community come into our church, not having this in our backyard. But we need to make sure people realize there's already people in our congregations who are going through this. This isn't a choice to either pay attention to it or not, to have a culture of care or not. Whether we want it in our backyard or not, which we should be okay with, given the ramifications of the gospel and of the fact that Jesus came into our backyard and from heaven, that we should be willing to go wherever we need to go, let alone being welcoming of people. But the idea of realizing this is already in our house, there's already people dealing with this in our churches, we need to address it. Another response is when people say, but they're a violent threat. I may have shared with you the story last week of a pastor who called me up and said, there's a person in my church who's hearing voices and I'm thinking of asking him not to come back anymore. What do you think, Dave? And basically he was worried because of a synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh that had just happened previous to that this person was going to be violent. What do you do about that? How do you handle it when church members or leaders are so afraid of people with mental illness that they don't want to address this? Well, I've talked a little bit about proximity for culture building, and a picture is worth 1,000 words. I'll say that, more than just trying to convince people. Now, you might think, Dave, what is wrong with you? Why are you saying Polo, Ice, Ice, Baby? And you may remember Ice, Ice, Baby as a song in the 90s by Vanilla Ice. Well, the reason I'm sharing it is I know of a man that got connected from our organization into a church. And his name is Paul, but he loves hip hop. And he used the name Polo Ice for his hip hop name. And he's a man with mental illness and struggles. And some people were a little bit distant from him when he started coming to the church. Well, someone in the church had a home recording studio, and they invited Paul to record his hip hop on their home recording studio. And then Paul, who has schizophrenia and hears voices and tells people about that experience in the church, the church, on a particular communion Sunday, they showed Paul's video of his Christian hip hop that he played for the church. And it was evident that perspectives on Polo Ice changed because they got to see the way in which he was just another person. He loved rap music. He loved praising God with his art, ways in which they thought he was violent, because I will also say there's some background that he has in his life that could concern people. But once they were proximate, once they saw that he was more than his mental illness, going back to the labeling piece, it made a huge change. So sometimes when you're concerned that people in your church are thinking, these people, we don't want them here, they just need to be getting served elsewhere by professionals. We need to creatively make opportunities for the people in our church to be around and see the different shades of the people with mental illness that we want to connect with in the life of our church. Another obstacle is some leaders have told me we are too busy with other things. We've got 1,000 things to do, right? We've got sermons to preach. We've got groups to lead. We've got people to visit. How do you expect us to have some sort of ministry to people with mental illness? And one phrase that we often like to use in reference to this and communicate to pastors and leaders is, it doesn't have to be the leader. It doesn't always have to be that the leaders of the church are the ones who spearhead creating a culture of care or spearhead new initiatives for people with mental illness. I know locally that there was a homeless shelter that closed down that was impacting a lot of people with mental illness. And there was we were trying to see how local churches could help. Well, one pastor said, I'm too busy, I can't do this, but there's this other person in my church who's really passionate about this issue. And this woman who is passionate about the issue worked in the midst of COVID, create a homeless shelter in their church that helped people to be able to be served within the church. It wasn't something that the leaders did, but it was something that had been identified in the church. So if you're a leader and you're thinking, this is too much, or other people think it's too much because we already have other things to do, remember that this might be an issue of identifying a person in your church who maybe has had a lived experience or as a family member, or who would just be just the right person to be passionate about this issue. So another obstacle, some churches say, but we aren't mental health professionals. You know, doesn't this person need a mental health professional? Shouldn't those clinics, those social service organizations, shouldn't they be the ones paying attention to this? We're a local church. It's not our job. But I want to point out that even professionals within the mental health field say that people with mental illness, for their own recovery and wellness, need personal support networks. In other words, personal support networks, not professional support networks, but people in the community helping individuals not to be isolated, but to be in relationship. That's not just a nice aside, a nice little cherry on the sundae. It's actually critical and foundational to people experiencing recovery from mental illness. So we aren't mental health professionals is not a sufficient reason not to be involved. Similarly, I've heard some people say, but isn't this the job of a therapist? I'm a pastor. I know spiritual health. I don't know mental health. This person should be going elsewhere for their support, not our church. One thing I'd want to say, though, to leaders who feel this way is our job is to help people live whole lives of worship and discipleship. In other words, even if we conceive of our job as churches to help people walk in the way of Jesus, live lives of worship, be disciples, one of the things we need to learn how to do is how to help people with mental illness live as disciples in relation to their mental illness. How do we help people say, this area of my mental health, how is this an area that I bring to God and worship versus just being an area that I think about in relation to a therapist and that has nothing to do with my faith? So as I go through these, I just want to clarify, the reason I'm structuring this part of the workshop this way is in order to provide and build a culture of care in our church, we need to know how to be able to make a case for doing this work to people in our church or leaders in our church that are not invested in it. And I hope that depending on whatever the pushback is, either verbally or non-verbally, or verbally and behaviorally, that some of these obstacles and how to respond to them helps you think through how to make a case and how to be an ambassador for this issue of mental illness. Another one, we talked about this a little bit at the end of last week. An obstacle can be, isn't talking about trauma going to cause legal problems? You know, you're bringing up these issues of mental illness and trauma, and I'm afraid that we're going to try to respond to this as a church, and we're going to say or do the wrong thing, and then someone's going to sue us. Again, shouldn't this just be an issue that we, you know, send off elsewhere, have other people involved in it? And there's a lot to say here, but one of the things to consider is when you're getting involved in these areas, don't jump into the deep end of the pool. In other words, it may be that you get pushback in you bringing up really important issues like trauma. But if that causes some people to be concerned because it sounds intense, perhaps start with some lower level issues that could be connected to trauma, but that might sound less overwhelming to certain leaders. Maybe you want to address anxiety. Maybe you want to address depression. Maybe you just want to use a broad label like mental health or wellness before getting into some of the more acute, severe, serious issues that might cause people to be afraid that they're going to get sued. So, as one colleague says, take a graduated response. You don't have to start all the way at the end of where you want to be. Start with what people can handle now if you're getting pushback on some things you're passionate about your church responding to. Another obstacle, some people say, but I don't know what to say. You know, like, this is too hard for me. How am I supposed to know how to respond to someone with a mental illness and talk to someone who tells me in my small group that they're dealing with this? And I want to remind us, if that's the obstacle in your church, that pastoral care is different than therapy. Therapy is valuable. It's good for you to have relationships, and we'll get into this in the next section. It's good for you to have relationships with external providers and professionals who can provide therapy and different forms of treatment. But that doesn't mean that pastoral care or congregational care or interpersonal ministry don't also play a crucial part and role in the lives of people with mental health struggles. Not every person with a mental illness wants every conversation they have to be therapy. In fact, I've interacted with some people who are saying, I'm kind of tired of talking about what I'm going through. I actually want someone who can just be a friend. I want someone who I can just do something with and feel normal alongside. That's a ministry your church can play, even if it isn't always sure how to say the right therapeutic thing in response to what someone's going through. So what I want to do now, in light of those obstacles, and I know I couldn't have listed all the obstacles that exist, in light of the obstacles, and then also some of the things that you can say in response, I have two questions I want you to consider and discuss in your breakouts. First, what are the main barriers in your context to addressing the issue of mental illness? I listed barriers I've seen in churches in our region, but what are the barriers you see to addressing mental illness? And then, which of the tools we discussed would be most appropriate for operationalizing a culture of care within your context? It might be one of the tools we talked about in the first section on creating a culture of care, or it might be one of the tools, one of the responses that I was offering in this section. Or maybe it's a tool I haven't even brought up yet that you realize is what you need to use to build a culture of care in your church. Thinking about your specific context and what you in your specific context need in order to address some of these obstacles and build a culture of care. And so with that in mind, before we go off in our breakouts, any questions from anything I've shared or about what we're asking you to discuss? Okay, why don't we take another 7 minutes for a time of breakout. Enton, anything else?
I think we're good. Unless someone has a quick question, we'll put you in your breakout rooms. Okay, here we go. Wow, and here we are again, Dave. So
Okay.
take it away.
So as we have done, just again, wanted to see, based on the two questions we asked, if there were any insights from your discussion that you'd love to share with the rest of the group, because you think it would be helpful to them, or any themes from your discussion that you'd want to share. So brave soul, like to go first.
One thing a couple of us had in common is it's not just a personal issue, it's a family issue. It's in the genetic makeup of our family. So parents, aunts and uncles, siblings, grandchildren, myself, a lot of us deal with it within our families as well as personalities.
Yes. And I think that can also, in this section, we've dealt a little bit with the obstacles, the reasons people give for not going there. And I think being able to tell not just your own story of your own mental health, but the story of the fact that my family has been involved in this, and therefore I'm someone, if you are comfortable with this, I'm someone who's willing to take the lead with some of this. I'm someone who's willing to be involved in trying to help our church move the ball down the field. I've probably seen people with family members who've gone through this be some of the people who've done the most in churches to create change because they're already invested. So I appreciate that point, Steve. Anyone else want to share an insight that came out of their discussion?
We just talked about small groups and how having small groups that meet on a regular basis to include those who are mentally ill or extended family could be a real important vehicle in a church to provide support.
Yes, definitely. I have certainly seen that several small groups have been places where people first share. They might not first feel comfortable in a Sunday morning experience, a mental health Sunday, a communion testimony. Some do, but I've seen several start off first with their small group, or I've seen small groups who will do a series on mental health. There is if you've ever seen it, but there is a ministry called Right Now Media that has a number of different small group videos that you can go through, and some of them deal with issues like mental illness. And so they're great for prompting small group discussions. Anyone else want to share something that they found helpful before we move on?
Was that called Right Now Media? Is that what you said?
That's right. That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you may not like all the resources, but there are definitely some resources there. They just have what seems like hundreds of videos and a DVD series and digital downloads that you can use to be able to use it in Sunday school settings or small group settings, some of which deal with mental health.
So
I'm sorry, what's that, Steve?
as chaplain, one of the things I think people need is a peer group whose values they trust, who they can meet with on a regular basis to monitor how well they're doing mentally. And I think the church does a good job of providing that.
Yes. It's a great way to put it. And I think asking those people when they're in that group, how can we be praying for you? How would you like us to talk about this? Again, to go back to, it was brought up earlier, the labeling question. How would you like us to talk about this? What language would you want us to use? How often do you want me to come back to this and check in with you about this? Those are all things a small group can do to have clarity about what the person's looking for. I want to take this moment to go into a couple of issues that you guys brought up early on, because this discussion has been focused on creating a culture of care in your faith community. And then we're going to talk about through it for the broader community. But a couple of things people brought up. One of them was, how do you deal with crisis in a church setting? And this overlapped a little bit with another question, though it was a little bit some shades of difference, which was, if it's your initial contact with someone who has an obvious mental illness and they seem like they are threatening, what do you do in those spaces? And I'll offer you a couple thoughts and then open it up to the room in case any of you have had experience with this or found certain things helpful. One of them is, while remaining true to what we've said about we want to treat people equally as humans, if you know, this is probably going to be more for if you know someone with mental illness and you know people have relationships with them, use the person who has a relationship with the individual to be able to take them to a more quiet space and stabilize and resolve the conversation, to de-escalate things. I can think of people in my church, for example, who live with a mental illness, and I know the people who take them out for breakfast. I know the people who are friends. And in addition to myself wanting to de-escalate things and help go for a walk together, I know that I could bring other people who have a relationship who know the thing to say. It has been said relationships are the vehicle for change, right? Because you have trust. Or last week, we talked about relational help being one of the 5 approaches that are important to helping people with mental health struggles. That's number one. Number two, depending on the nature of the situation, it's good to have in your phone, this was mentioned about collaborative help at the end of last week's training. We talked about having in your phone the number for your local mobile crisis team. Typically, each county's mental health system or county social services will have a mobile crisis number. And if you have that in your phone, because things are really escalating, you could call them up. What's going on is a lot of law enforcement doesn't want to be taking all their time responding to mental health crises instead of dealing with serious crime. And therefore, mobile crisis teams are being implemented in different counties so that they can be the ones to be the first responders to a mental health crisis, with the hopes not that the people will get hospitalized, but with the hopes that the person can have their crisis stabilized, resolved, put to bed at night, and then ultimately the next day begin working on how they can handle future crises. So if that's a number that you could call, and they should be able to come out. Now, if people are at physical risk, then you want to call 911. Right? So mobile crisis is not there if someone is physically unsafe. That's where law enforcement would come out for that. But if you sense a situation where people are shouting and they're struggling, but safety isn't an issue, you're just noticing we're in the middle of our service and this person's shouting, or we're in this space where people are struggling to know how to relate to them. That's where first, a person who has a relationship, or I would say first, those who are around who feel comfortable. Second, is there a person who has a relationship with the person? Third, mobile crisis. Fourth, if it's really something that's unsafe, 911. With that said, I want to hear from you. Does anyone here have other thoughts on what you think would be helpful strategies if there was a crisis in a church setting?
Sometimes it depends on the number of people that are there, but it's a lot easier for the group to move than to move that individual.
Great point. That's right. If possible, that's a great, if it's a smaller group or if it's a setting where the others in that space can step out of the room, then the person can remain in the room. That's a great point, Sarah. I would also say, this might go without saying, but I think it's worth remembering the value of a non-anxious presence, the value of not matching their level of angst, but as best as you can, remaining even keel with a quiet voice. One of the things I've seen in our mobile crisis team as our organization is just the way in which they often are responding quietly, not annoyingly quiet, but appropriately quiet and even keel to people who are in crisis, because even the behavior and the tone of your voice, more than the content of your words, may help a person to calm down. And again, also, we talked about this last week. Don't underestimate the value of listening and asking questions versus trying to control and pay a power play. Again, if you need to protect people, that's one thing. But if you're just finding yourself anxious because of the other person's response, you can find yourself actually making it worse by responding in kind versus trying to de-escalate the situation. Any other thoughts on how to respond to those situations? Okay, so I'll just say before we move into the next one, to kind of put a fine point on it, you can build for later by investing relationally in people where that might be a question, where you might be unsure. I remember, it's not the exact situation, but I remember a church calling me in for a conversation because there was a man who would be walking around the children's wing of their church. And so people in the church were saying, what is going on with this guy? This doesn't feel safe. And they should call, they should be concerned. But as we went out and talked to the family and talked to this person, it became evident that the person did have some mental health, some serious mental illness, and the person was relatively isolated in the church. He came with his parents, but no one talked to him. So he didn't just walk in the children's wing, he walked all around the church because he had nothing else to do. And so what he needed was certain people to invest in him. And so there was a couple guys in the church who just began sitting with him and hanging out with him and getting to know him so that they could help him with some of the cultural cues around what was appropriate and what wasn't in terms of how to do church life, where to walk and where not to walk. One of the things I've seen in my years in the mental health system is sometimes the strange ways that some people with mental illness act aren't always an issue of the symptoms of the mental illness, but the isolation that they experience means they do not have as much clarity around social cues, emotional intelligence, what's appropriate and inappropriate things to say in public settings. It's not the issue of a symptom of the illness. It's an issue of the symptom of isolation and lack of doing life together. And so that's not to say it's true of all situations, but for some, and therefore you investing relationally earlier on may help avoid those crises happening and maybe another resource to respond to the crisis when it occurs. Okay, any other thoughts before we move on? Okay, I'm going to go ahead again and share my screen.
Hey, this is Bruce.
This is Brooke.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
yes.
I've been in situations, I was a pediatrician for years, but I got into situations where one individual dealing with schizophrenia can be quite a spectrum, but the ones you worry about only are the ones who are paranoid schizophrenics, as far as people in being in danger. But when they not on the medication, that's a really problem with schizophrenics. If they take their medication, they can be pretty good, but when they don't and they choose not to, they can get. But this one was paranoid schizophrenic, and he was intended to kill. And I was the subject of that. But try to interface with him. But ultimately, what we did, there was one state trooper who was a detective. I knew he's very good. I knew for experience that he was very good in this situation because we had to get him into the mental health unit. There's no question about it. But the group that we got together finally all kept their cool, and we had to secure him to protect everybody because it was that one form of schizophrenia. They're dangerous when he's not on his meds, and with the psych unit. We also had one that was going and taking IVs out of everybody. She had extreme mania that, which I found out later, she didn't mind being manic. She didn't want to be depressed. She had the swings at times because she felt totally empowered when she was in that manic phase. Same kind of thing. We had to get people who kept their cool. We needed the police involved, but we picked who very carefully because we knew once you didn't want to do this because they'd just explode. We keep their heads on. You're talking about keeping their heads so they don't make the situation worse. We get them into a mental health unit again to get back on meds. But that's the exceptions that happen, though. Those extremes do happen. But those are ones it's good to know people who to help, who won't inflame the situation worse. You're right about that. And of course, I think one of the things the church can do, if the individual becomes part of the church, is to encourage them to stay on the meds.
Yes, and I would say that I've seen both. I've seen situations where there are people where medications have played a key role. I've seen some people where they have stepped off their meds for a time and it hasn't had the adverse effect for certain people. But I think that's where relational help comes in, because learning what's this unique person's story, what helps them, what doesn't help them. Are they talking to their doctor? Do they have people in their life who they can have the medication conversation with? Because sometimes we may not even be aware in a church setting what diagnoses people may have. We just may be clear that there's some behaviors that we're surprised by that we see in people. And therefore, getting to know them and learning from them what helps and what doesn't, and being aware of their support system. You remember last week we talked about RAP planning and the idea of being able to write out in that plan, who are the people in your life you could call when you're in a crisis situation? What are the things you need to be doing as part of your wellness toolbox or your daily maintenance plan, which, as Bruce mentioned, medication may in fact be part of that. Seeing a doctor regularly may be a part of that, but we won't know that until we build a relationship with the person and learn about what their experiences have been. And even if we say, which may be totally true, you should be on your medication or you should be seeing your doctor, in my experience, people don't respond to you should or you need to unless you've built the relational capital that they trust you and will respond. Otherwise, they will just experience you as someone who's trying to control them. And for some people with mental illness, they've had so many experiences of being controlled and hospitalizations, being 302'd, involuntarily hospitalized, that there's some resistance to that. And so the more we can build relationships, the better we can respond in those crisis moments. Well, for time's sake, guys, we're going to move on to the next part of tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So we've talked about how to build a culture of care in your faith community. Now let's talk about how to do it through your faith community in the lives of people outside your congregation. There's some obstacles to outreach that I want to name. One is, and these are quotes that I've heard from people. One is, I remember someone saying from within a church, I want to serve, but I don't know where the needs are. So how do I serve? How can I serve my community and people with mental illness in my broader community when I don't know where the needs actually are? And yet, I found this funny because when I heard this, I knew at Access, the organization I work at, we were serving someone on his street. So there were needs around him. There just needed to be collaboration between his church and the organizations in the community that can make those connections. A couple of these I stated last week, but I wanted to repeat them because they fit. I've heard churches who say, I don't make referrals because I don't know who I can trust. There's obstacles to outreach because you don't know what organizations you can reach out to collaborate with because you don't trust those organizations. Third, I mentioned the pastor who, in a discussion I was a part of where I was moderating a discussion between pastors and mental health professionals, he said to this room of mental health professionals, I didn't even know you guys existed. Sometimes it's just ignorance. There's a lack of understanding and knowledge of what partners exist in the community. Fourth, some people have said, we don't partner with them because they aren't moving in the same direction. In other words, a church will say, I don't want to reach out with this other church or this other organization because we don't share values and we aren't moving in the same direction. These are some of the obstacles to outreach, to serving the needs of people outside your church with mental illness, many of whom are served in the mental health system. And maybe you would see your church in one of these obstacles, or maybe you can think of another obstacle that would keep your church from reaching out to local mental health services and reaching out to the needs of people with mental illness in your community. In light of that, what are some tools for reaching out and getting connected? I want to talk about a few tools that you can use in your own space. First, create a care portal. I mentioned briefly last week that we created a care portal that connects faith communities with community needs. Right now, the platform is Facebook. We have our organization that posts the needs of people that they serve, and people from faith communities join that page and respond to those needs. Maybe your church would want to partner with a local mental health service organization to establish a care portal that allowed churches to serve people being served already by mental health service organizations. Second, build with Brittany. What do I mean by this? Brittany is the name of someone who works in a local community mental health center. Each of your communities will have a local community mental health center in it. That was part of, I believe, the 1964 Mental Health Act, or 63, maybe it's 63. You will have a local community mental health center with people like Brittany who want to partner with the faith community. Brittany's a member of a faith community herself, and she wanted to know, how do I do this? How do I build bridges to local organizations, to local faith communities? What you might want to do is reach out to your local community mental health center and say, hey, I'm a church, and we want to serve people that are currently receiving services at your organization. We want to offer them community. Who could I talk to there that I might be able to partner with? 3, call your conversation partner. That story I told earlier about the pastor who said, I'm wondering if I should ask him not to come back. He knew that in Intersect, he had a conversation partner, someone he could call. Who is a conversation partner that you could call when you have questions? Maybe it's the type of questions like the crisis situation we were just discussing. Or maybe you're just thinking, man, I want to know where to find the needs in my community. Find a conversation partner. Maybe it could be someone within your church who's a professional, or someone in a local organization that you trust. Fourth, join a community collaborative. There's multiple collaboratives in my broader community of social service providers who get together to talk about the needs in the local community. They would love, oftentimes, for there to be representatives from churches and faith communities in their collaborative as well. Do you know what collaboratives exist? You could look up on the website of your county's mental health department or drug and alcohol department to learn more about that, and to call someone there and say, what are the local collaborative networking spaces that our church can get involved in? Fifth, develop a resource list. Do you have a list of the resources that you trust among social service organizations, in mental health organizations, in your community? A few more tools, this for not just getting connected, but now getting equipped. You may have heard of spiritual first aid. Spiritual first aid is a resource out of Wheaton College's Humanitarian and Disaster Institute. It is a way of basically trying to help churches know how to love their neighbors after a crisis has occurred in your community. But they've been spreading it to also include just how to love people with spiritual resources within the Christian tradition, but now they have a community model as well, how to use those tools to support people with mental illness in your broader community. You might want to get equipped with a QPR training, question, persuade, refer, which is suicide intervention. It's about an hour and a half. You might want to get equipped with an assist training, which is a 2-day suicide intervention training through Living Works, which is a Canadian organization, but many trainings like that in the States. You might want to consider becoming a subscriber or a ministry partner with Intersect, where you could call us if you need consultation for particular issues, or if you need consultation around how to serve your community. So we've talked about, when you're talking about serving or building a culture of care through your faith community, we've talked about tools for getting connected with your community. We've just now talked about tools for getting equipped to serve your community. Now, a few tools for getting a response within your community. In other words, if you're trying to build up people in your church, raise up people in your church to serve the community, how do you do that? One is respond to a pressing need. We have a Better Together series. It's an 8-week training that we give to communities who are looking to collaborate across sectors. Think service organizations, local government, and faith communities, all coming together to respond to a pressing need. Our need in our county right now is homelessness. We have had, since the pandemic, hundreds, I think 600 extra homeless people in our county since the pandemic. We have been coming together as a community to respond to this specific need. We're not saying we want to collaborate. We're collaborating to respond to the need. When you do this, also to consider, tell stories, not just statistics. In other words, as you're talking to service organizations, learn about some of the real needs in your community. We had recently done this in our church. We had heard from a local therapist about a woman who was about to be homeless within days. We communicated to our church about this woman who, with her toddler, was going to be homeless. And a couple in the church, Robin and Megan, opened up one of their bedrooms to this woman and her girl for the month. Tell stories about the real needs in your community, not just statistics, because telling stories really tugs at the heartstrings and humanizes people rather than just being a number. Bring what you've got, which is to say, each of your churches has some different types of resources. Right now, in responding to the homeless situation in our community, I reached out to a local church who has a part of their building where they can have a code blue shelter when it gets really cold out. They have a house on their property where they can have transitional housing. there's other things they can't do. They might not have as many volunteers as some other churches. They might not have as much money as other churches, but they've got buildings they can use for the homeless. So what are the resources that are distinctive to your church that you could offer the local systems of care? Fourth, step outside the narthex and even into Starbucks. Strange statement, but what do I mean? We had a person in my church, I'm sorry, not my church, at Access, who wanted to get connected to a church, but because of his background and difficult experiences with the church and his own mental illness, he wasn't sure he was ready to do that yet. He wanted to meet with a pastor. He wanted to meet with a representative from a church. I called one church and said, are any of your leaders willing to meet me and this man who wants to try out churches? They said, no, he can show up on Sunday morning. These are the times we meet, but we don't, he said, we don't provide that ministry. And I was thinking, you don't provide the ministry of just going out for coffee with someone who wants to join your church? I was puzzled, but I called another church who said, yeah, when are we going to do it? He got together with us at Starbucks. He answered the questions of this man, and this man and his family continue to go to this church now, probably 7 years later. Fifth, think outside the box and Sunday morning, which is to say, sometimes reaching out to people with mental illness in the community might not mean they show up on Sunday mornings. There's a church called Redemption Church in our area where they have a book club. And one of the men at our organization, the social service organization I work at, he wasn't yet ready to go to worship at a church. But when he heard this church had a book club, he went to that and he's continued to go to that. And this church has played a significant role in his life, not through the Sunday morning worship experience, as integral as that is, but through their book club. What are other external spaces, what some people call third spaces, where you can offer people with mental illness in your community to get together and meet people in your church? So now we're going to spend some time in discussion, and I think we're going to only do 4 minutes this time as we come to the end of our time. But these are the 2 questions I want you to ask. What are pressing needs in your broader community that you may wish to address? You know, is there a need related to mental illness? When you're at the intersection of mental illness, you find yourself at the intersection of a lot of other things. Sometimes it's substance use. Sometimes it's homelessness. A lot of other issues that arise. Are there certain needs in your community that you go, you know what? Our church can respond to that. Second, what is one tool you'd like to begin using to build a culture of care through your faith community? When you think of this whole training, is there one tool, one thing you'd like to do to begin building a culture of care through your community into the broader region in which your faith community, your church is there to serve? Any questions about what we're going to discuss in this next 4 minutes? Okay. Ensign, anything else before we break out?
I think we're good. Everybody ready? Okay, here we go into breakouts. Wow, that was pretty quick. We're all here, Dave, so back to you.
Okay. So guys, we have 6 minutes left. So what I want to do is really focus on that final question. What's one tool, or to put it differently, what's one thing you would like to do in your specific context to be able to make headway in this area of supporting people with mental illness, either in your congregation or community? Would anyone like to share what that one thing might be for them?
Well, for me, I shared that I too have a diagnosis. And then once I have that rapport with a person, I share what it means to be in recovery, what it means to successfully manage the illness that I have.
I'm muted.
So I'm hearing you say that you're going to be intentional about sharing about your own lived experience, your own story, and then you're going to also be intentional about building relationships with people who've had that experience, who then, which is part of what you already do. Would that be fair to say, Steve, or is there another way to say that?
Yes, and then how to manage your illness.
How to manage it. Nice. Thanks, Steve. Anyone else want to share what's one thing they will do? Yeah, Brenda. You're on. Yep.
Yeah, I couldn't get it to turn off.
Sorry.
Brenda, hold your mic up. Yeah, that'll help us hear you.
I just realized tell the stories, and I write little vignettes about people and publish them in our district newsletter. So maybe I could do the same thing for the church and write and humanize people.
I love that.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Tell me the story. That might be a way to do it.
It's amazing how churches can be, people just come out of nowhere to respond to stories of real people that they can identify with versus just faceless needs as told by statistics. Not that it's not important to hear that, but it just doesn't go far enough. So that's a great idea, Brenda. Anyone else, something in their unique context that you feel like you can do to move the ball down the field?
I like the idea of maybe even bringing somebody in from the outside, because we're a fairly small community, to maybe get things started on the sharing.
That's wise. I like that. I like that idea. Yeah, and it's kind of, it's a reverse a little bit of when I talked about bring what you've got, like what does your community have? Just as important to that is, okay, what are the limitations of my community and how can we seek out the larger community or the larger body of Christ to be able to be a resource for us? So it doesn't have to only be what you've got, but what do people outside have that can be of benefit to us? Great. One more thing that someone would want to share that they think they would like to do in their unique context to make more progress in this area.
I think that one thing I can do is really move forward. I mean, we're such a small group that we just would have one little small group of the same people, but have the small group and have the conversation, because I know there's several people in the congregation would be in the small group that need a place to share their struggles. So I'm willing to do that.
It's great, Susan. I think one powerful thing about what you just said is, on the one hand, it can seem so simple, like we're just going to have the conversation. And yet the number of things I've seen happen out of simply having the conversation that hasn't happened yet, it's pretty amazing. So those conversations, while seemingly simple, can be life-changing.
Yeah.
So guys, what I'm going to do to close out our time in the last minute is I'm just going to share the screen one more time briefly to touch base on a couple of things. And one of those, just for time's sake, I'll say this. If you want to stick around a little bit because you're still itching and you would like to scratch more around any issues we haven't discussed, I've tried to touch on each of the ones you've brought up, but just know you can stay after and we can talk more about that. But I also wanted to say If I can be of any help, if Intersect, the initiative I lead, can be of any help to your specific church, just know that you can reach out to me at any of these places. We have an Intersect newsletter where you can learn more about upcoming events, an information and training guide, information on our portal. And Enton will also be sending out this PowerPoint presentation so that you have that as well. And I'd like to close with just a verse from Galatians, which I think is a helpful summary of where we've been, where Paul tells the Galatian believers, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us work for the good of all, especially for those who belong to the household of faith. In other words, there are opportunities for us to work for the good of people with mental illness, both within our church, but also in our broader community at this current moment. And my prayer for you is that as a result of our time together last week and this week, there might at least be one thing that God and Spirit may be prompting you to consider you can do within the context where He has placed you. Thank you so much for you guys taking the time to be with me these last 2 weeks. And Enton, is there anything else that would be helpful for people to hear as we go?
Yes, Dave, please accept the thanks of all of us who participate in Ventures and help make this happen. Thank you for sharing with us these last 2 weeks. The recordings should be available within the next week, so I will email those links to you when they become available. And we're just really grateful, Dave, for all that you've done in leading this. And it's an encouragement for others to keep coming back for the other Ventures programs that we put together. And we trust they will all be as high a quality as this one, because they sure have been so far. Dave, do you also want to have any other final word to send us out? The Galatian scripture was a good one, but I want to open that space for you just in case you have something else.
I wonder if I could just say a brief word of prayer for you guys as we go.
Okay.
Father, thank you so much for this group. It is because of you and your love and your grace that we are here. We are interested in knowing how we can serve people because you first served us. We want to love people well because you first loved us. Help us to take your presence and your concern for people who are going through these difficult challenges. Help us take that love that you have into our churches, into the streets and communities where we serve, that we might be able to look back on these 2 nights and the conversations we've had together and see how you were working there to bring about real change in real communities and in real people's lives. We can't do any of this without the power of your Spirit working through us. So please do that, and please do that through this group of people as they head out tonight. It's in Jesus' name we pray all this. Amen.
Thank you, Dave.
Everyone.
That concludes our course. If you want to stick around and ask a few questions, Dave's agreed to be here for a few more minutes, but please feel free to go, and thank you for joining us.
No,
Thank you.